Hey there, welcome back to another video. This time around, it is a review of the 1990 horror anthology, The Willies. Now, this is actually a request from a longtime subscriber and friend of mine named Adam. I hope this is worth the wait. I know it's been a while, but I've been having a lot more free time lately, so I decided to check this out. Now, before I get into my review of this movie, I have to make a little disclaimer here. This film is written and directed by Brian Peck. And Brian Peck is a pedophile. He's a legitimate monster. And, but despite that, I don't think it's fair to forever associate this film with his actions. Because unlike something like Clown House and Victor Salva, as far as I know, there is no evidence that proves that Peck molested any of the kids on the set of this film. Now, if there's any information that is divulged or is found out in the future that's not the case, then I will be one of the first to change my mind. But until then, I don't think it should be forever associated with his actions later on in his life, because I think that's doing a disservice to everyone else who worked on this movie, from the other actors and actresses to the effects technicians, to people like Tony Gardner who worked on the effects, the makeup effects for the movie. I don't think it's really fair to forever sully their names and their contributions because of what Brian Peck did and because of what he is. That's why I was still going to do this video despite my knowledge of the legitimate monster that Brian Peck is. So I'm sorry if that was a little bit of a bummer for you guys, but I wouldn't feel right if I didn't mention that when it comes to this particular film. And if you like this movie, don't feel guilty, don't feel pressured because of what Peck has done. I don't think that's fair either. Wave your Willies flag high, however high you want to. I mean, for instance, Brian Peck is a big part of Return of the Living Dead. And you don't see a lot of people saying, "Oh, how dare you like that one? Like, what are you doing? Brian Peck's a child molester." Like, they don't do that. So don't feel too bad. Because ultimately, I would say I thought this was all right. I thought this was a decent time waster. It's not something I really want to watch anytime soon because of how legitimately skeevy Brian Peck is. And because he's honestly a huge part of this movie. He wrote and directed this film. So his fingerprints are all over this. But I'm going to try as hard as I can to separate the art from the artist. So Brian Peck's direction is nowhere near as problematic as he is. And neither is the screenplay. I would say the direction is honestly the definition of adequate. It's average. It's not really anything that special, but it gets the job done. I think it honestly would have benefited from a better director. The direction is fairly static. Anytime that it has any legitimate atmosphere, I think it's not really due to the direction. I think it's due to the lighting. Or the effects work by other people. It's one of those films where it really does play out like a TV movie, like a failed pilot for a TV show called The Willies, instead of a feature film. But I've seen worse direction for sure. I mean, this is not... And I've seen way worse anthologies. I think on like one source it has like a 1.5 out of 5. I don't think it's that bad. I've seen a lot worse. Like, this isn't on the same level as crap like Creepshow 3 This is definitely better than those. And I would say when it comes to PG-13 young adult horror anthologies, I would say this is one of the better ones that I've seen, because it still has a edge to it, which a lot of those type of anthologies for kids lack. A lot of ways I felt that Brian Peck's screenplay, his writing, definitely captured the vibe of EC Comics, and you could tell that it's something that he was a fan of, because in the Flyboy segment, Gordy Belcher has a bunch of weird science comics on his wall. So, but on the other hand, I can't lie and say I wouldn't have liked to have had a different director and a different writer who was equally as passionate about EC Comics and tongue-in-cheek horror anthologies be the person behind this movie, because then I could honestly enjoy or appreciate it without the stigma that it has. And I'm trying as hard as I can to separate myself, separate things from that, but it's difficult. But it's still a movie that I ultimately do feel is worth watching if you're a fan of horror anthologies. It reminded me a lot of ways of Are You Afraid of the Dark, or Goosebumps, or Monsters. It had that vibe and that feel to it. The script, though, isn't great. I definitely feel it does have its fair share of issues. For one, I think when it comes to the little short stories in the beginning, there's only one of them that is any good. The other two are honestly quite lame. In terms of the longer stories, I would say Bad Apples is the only one that is legitimately solid all the way through. Flyboy has some elements and aspects of the story that work, but there are other aspects that are completely undone by the film's low budget, and I also feel that it drags on a little bit too much. There are a lot of things that could have been cut or trimmed out, and ultimately the wraparound segment is okay, but it's not anything particularly amazing. But I've seen much worse wraparounds as well. And when it comes to other aspects of the production, like the cinematography or the editing or the music in particular, there's some nice little notes to it. I particularly don't mind the opening credits music. Speaking of opening credits, I really like the artwork and the designs that were used for the opening credits. I thought that really did a great job capturing the overall mood and vibe that the film was trying to go for. But yeah, the writing, it's not woeful, but it's not anything I would say is entirely commendable either. It's about as adequate and as average as the overall direction. There's some clever stuff in it. Like, for one, I thought the reference to the Goonies I thought was really clever, because Sean Astin is a part of the cast. So that was fun to see. Now, in terms of the cast, speaking of the cast, it's not that bad of a cast. So you have Sean Astin, who plays Michael, Jason Horst, who plays Kyle. We have Joshua John Miller, who plays Josh. James Karen, he plays Uncle Harry and Mr. Jenkins. Dana Ashbrook has a little bit role as a tough dude. He was in Twin Peaks. You have Bill Irwin, who plays the old man in the haunted house segment in the prologue. You might recognize him as the same old man sort of character in Home Alone. He was the older man who had a ticket, and there was something going on with Kevin's mom, Catherine O'Hara. She was trying to get a ticket to go see her son, and because he's home alone, and he was the older guy who she almost got the ticket by trading him her jewelry and stuff like that, but then his wife comes in and puts the kibosh on it. So he's in this. It's nice to see him again. Doug Benson, the comedian, he has a little bit role as a zombie in that segment. He's completely unrecognizable, though, because he's just hidden under all the zombie makeup. You also have Kimmy Robertson, who plays the ride operator. She's been in a lot of things. And in terms of other actors and actresses, you've got Kathleen Freeman, who plays Miss Titmarch, who's the main character, the nerdy kid, Daniel, in Bad Apples. She is his teacher, this bitchy, grouchy teacher. And she seemed to play a lot of those roles. Like, if they needed some older gal who's grouchy, McGroucherson, they would go with Kathleen Freeman. I remember her the most in Inner Space as the gal with the red head. I mean, with the red hair and the lighter that looks like a pistol. Do I look like I carry that kind of cash around on me? So yeah, it's always fun to see Kathleen Freeman. Gulager is also in this as the principal of Greeley High. Ian Freed plays Danny Hollister, the main character in Bad Apples. Michael Bauer plays Gordy Belcher, the sick, twisted, fat fuck, just a really, really awful person that is Gordy Belcher in Flyboy. Michael Bauer did a good job. He did what he was asked to do, and did a quite remarkable job with this character. That you're supposed to hate this kid, and as the segment goes on, like, you loathe this kid. You're like, this is a kid who's going to grow up to be a serial killer. Like, this kid is messed up. And you also have some cameos by Kirk Cameron and Tracey Gold, who play their Mike and Carol Seaver characters, I think from Growing Pains, because there's a nightmare sequence where they show up and they talk to the camera. So that's a fun little tidbit. So the film is split up into a really weird structure. So you have the prologue, which has the three kids. They're talking about gross stories to one another. And that's where you have the three short stories that start the film. So you have Tennessee Fricassee, Haunted Estate, and Poodle Souffle. Out of those three, the only one I like is Haunted Estate. Tennessee Fricassee, way too much energy. This is one of those segments where the energy is just obnoxious. I think it's trying to be a cartoon, but it just comes across as forced, with all these just highly exaggerated motions and acting. You know, the camera zooming in and out, and people going, ah! You know, it's just this over the top stuff that I honestly have never really cared for the most part. It works in a cartoon because it's animated, and animation can have a certain style, and it can do things that live action can't. So when you're trying to do that kind of thing in live action, a lot of it just turns out to be overcompensating, and that's incredibly obvious. So and it was very predictable. Like, oh, there's a rat in her chicken. Okay, all right, whatever. Haunted Estate, though, I liked it. Had some great effects by Alterian Studios, Tony Gardner and company. A zombie effect. There was like a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde character. I think there might have been a vampire. I might be wrong though, but some nice atmosphere as well. Some good lighting. Reminded me a lot of a old school haunted house. So that was a fun segment. Poodle Souffle. What the fuck is this segment? This segment is disturbing on a whole other level. Like, yes, it's a kid's horror film, so they can't show that much. But it's just the overall act of putting a poodle in a microwave. That's disturbing. And that's really messed up. That's animal abuse. So it's a really hard segment to watch because it's just like, what are they doing here? And a kid's telling this story, and it's like tongue in cheek and it's supposed to be campy, but I'm sitting there and I'm like, this is really fucked up. And it also, it's one of those, it's like, what's the point? Like, this, a lot of these segments are just like, oh, they're telling gross stories. So this older lady, she's got a toy poodle. She, I guess, gave it a bath and needs to dry it off. But the producers and the people who worked on this movie, they didn't even bother to make the dog wet. The dog is clearly bone dry, but, you know, whatever. And the dog also has had this trim on its fur that's so thin that you would not need to dry it off that much except with a towel. But I guess this lady is senile, or she's got dementia or something, or she's just crazy. She puts the dog in the microwave, and then you know what happens next. The dog explodes. So it's not anatomically correct. It's not gory in a way like the Fly remake when the baboon gets sent through the telepod, but it's still, it's just the overall concept behind it. It's so just mean-spirited and just screwed up. And it doesn't fit with the overall vibe or tone of the other segments in this prologue. Or, yeah, I mean, it's just, I don't know why they went there. Apparently this scene is not included in some versions of this movie. And I can definitely see why. I think it's some versions overseas or something like that. They don't have that particular segment. But anyway, after these kids share their gross stories, then Michael, Sean Astin, starts telling the story about this school custodian named Mr. Jenkins. And this is where you get bad apples. And this one, you have a nerdy kid named Danny, and he's bullied by these kids who give Iron Maiden a bad name because the main bully's wearing an Iron Maiden shirt and he's a jerk off. And I'm just like, man. And then I'm like, since when were bullies like into heavy metal? Like I always thought like that was a nerdy thing back in the late 80s. I mean, if you look at like Trick or Treat, the 1986 film, like, you don't want to be into metal, man, because that's not cool. But anyway, the kid is there's a kid wearing Iron Maiden. He's an Iron Maiden shirt and like, what is it, like spiked gloves and shit. So this kid, he's the leader of the group, and they're bullying this kid named Danny. These bullies are really creative. I'll give them that. They find a way to suspend Danny from the ceiling with a fire hose. So I gotta give them some credit, but at the same time, these kids are jerks. And since this is a very EC Comics kind of story, you know they're gonna get their just desserts. And oh boy, do they. So Danny, the only friend he has is the custodian, Mr. Jenkins, played by James Karen. And honestly, one of his best roles. I thought he did a really good job with this. And he's telling Danny, you know, after he takes him down from the ceiling, and always be there for you, da 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 da. Danny goes in to check on him after he goes into the bathroom. He doesn't see him anywhere. He goes to one of the stalls, opens it, and there's a monster in there. And it's honestly a really great effect by Tony Gardner. I think it's a really cool looking monster. So Danny's understandably scared, essentially scared shitless. So he's late to his class with Mrs. Titmarsh, who's an absolute total stone cold bitch, and she's giving him a hard time. He's got to take this surprise test because he saw the monster in the bathroom. He doesn't want to go, so he pees his pants. Then, of course, he gets ridiculed for that. He already got ridiculed for coming in and saying there's a monster in the bathroom. Miss Titmar, she's had enough, takes Danny to the bathroom. There's a typical sort of fake out scene where she opens a stall and there's no monster in there. But then the monster pops up through the ceiling, grabs her, eats her. And there's actually a good amount of blood. So, which was honestly pretty surprising for a PG-13 film. So, eats her, blood sprays everywhere. Danny goes back to the classroom, tells them what happened. You know, a lot of the kids don't believe him. The bullies, he gets them to follow him to the bathroom. He locks them in. They get eaten by the monster. And yes, it does paint Danny in a pretty negative light. Makes him look like a pretty crazy person himself. At least a sociopath. But that's how it is with EC Comics type stories. Like, there really aren't any heroes. Everyone's a villain. Everyone's got corrupt morals. So that definitely does fit in line with the overall vibe of an EC comic. And there's a really cool shot of Mr. Jenkins up in I think it's like the attic of the school. And the monster that is Mr. Jenkins is putting on human hands and then puts on a human face. There was a nice twist that the monster is Mr. Jenkins. I thought that was pretty clever. And I thought the makeup effects, once again, were really well done by Tony Gardner and company. The only thing I didn't like about this segment is the fact that after that scene in the attic, there's a scene tacked on that happens like a few years later where Mr. Jenkins is working at another school and there's a kid that goes missing and the parents and the principal are asking him where he is, and ultimately you find out he ate him. And I just didn't feel that was necessary. You could have had that in just one little throwaway line of dialogue. I felt it was a little too tacked on, kind of it felt like padding. Then the two other kids, they share their story, which turns out to be Flyboy. We have Gordy Belcher, who's just this absolutely despicable fat piece of shit who is legitimately crazy. He's obsessed with flies, which in itself is a very creepy and just yucky concept. He makes these really weird dioramas with fly carcasses. He's torturing flies by pulling their wings off. And he's just completely losing grip on reality as each day goes by. He steals manure from this farmer named Farmer Spivey. Farmer Spivey almost shoots him with a shotgun. Actually, he does fire a shotgun at him, but he doesn't actually hit him. Ultimately, you get more and more revelations of how truly messed up this kid is. And I think the segment drags a little bit too much because they just keep hammering home how fucking crazy this kid is. And it's like, we get it. We understand. He's a sick fat fuck who's obsessed with flies. Okay, I understand. You have a scene where he gives this poor girl at his school cookies with dead flies in them. I will say this about this segment. There are some effective aspects to it. Does a good job making you hate this kid and making you absolutely demand his comeuppance, which is that's a good sort of EC Comics type of story. But it's not as fun as a lot of these EC Comics stories are. It doesn't have the same fun, consistent fun as something like Bad Apples or other stronger EC Comics stories. You just, as it goes on, you're just like, I hate this kid. I don't even want to see this kid anymore. I will say this. Another thing that I do like about this segment is how honest it is. His parents, they do not pull any punches. Like, they're super honest about this kid and how screwed up he is. I like that. You don't see that very often in these kind of stories. And I really appreciated the fact that they had multiple scenes where the stepfather and the mother are like, "This is enough. This is just too much. I've had it. You're no more flies. You're crazy." Um, so what happens? To make a long story short, Farmer Spivey. That's a different kind of character in a different movie altogether. Farmer Spivey, he has this manure that has these really crazy growth properties. It can make carrots gigantic and tomatoes big, and as a fake sign of gratitude, he gives Gordy some special batch. And because Gordy's using this manure to grow flies. And he is in need of flies more than ever because his parents finally had enough of his crazy ass and took all the flies out of his dioramas and took all his flies away. So he's in need of more flies. So he uses the manure, the Miracle Grow manure, to get more flies. And of course, what he gets is more flies, but he gets gigantic human-sized flies, because that's what. And it was a very special batch too that had extra growth hormone. Now this is also where you have a nightmare sequence. Actually happens before the giant flies come in, which is fairly well done. I would say this nightmare sequence is easily one of the best things in the film. There's a sequence where he wakes up and his bed is just full of maggots, and that is a sequence that is not for the squeamish and is very unnerving because it's done for real. This is not Rice Krispies or any of this shit. Like, this is real maggots. And that's where you have the Growing Pains cameo with the characters where they speak to the camera and talk to Gordy. And you have a effectively nightmarish part of that nightmare sequence where he goes to the kitchen to get a midnight snack. He opens up the fridge door and he sees himself dead, covered in flies. So that was a nice well done part of that sequence. But then you get to the climax, the big reveal of the big flies. It's the cheapest, lamest, silliest, most laughable fly costumes you'll ever see. Like, how do you go from this really good monster by Tony Gardner and the really cool-looking monsters in the Haunted House Prologue segment to this fucking silly goofball shit that's not believable, not in the slightest? It's laughable. It's fucking laughable. Excuse me. I get indigestion just thinking about it because it's just so fucking laughable. And that's your reveal. It's supposed to be scary. It's supposed to be the big grand finale. And it's these fucking guys in suits. Like, this shit looks like, I think there's like an episode of Rocko's Modern Life that deals with, I think it was like fleas. It's like if those cartoon fleas were brought to life in live action, but instead of fleas, they're flies. It's a really just cornball looking effect. Like, this is cheesy. Like, all, the Ninja Turtles from the 90s movies, that's not cheesy, folks. You want to see what cheesy effects are? Go check out the flies in the end of Flyboy. That's pure cheese. And it's too bad because there's a potential with this finale because it's effectively brutal. I mean, they rip his arms off. They give him a taste of his own medicine because he was ripping the fly's wings off and shit for fun. So they rip his arms off. Somehow he survives, though. I don't know how. He survives, and he's got like fake arms, with the hooks. And that's really how that segment ends. And then you have the wraparound, which it's revealed that Michael's, Uncle Harry is actually Mr. Jenkins. And he reveals his monster persona to the kids. And I guess as a city where he's going to eat them? I guess. Is Michael also a monster? Because I think it's his dad? Don't know. And that's a wrap. That's the Willies. I would say it's fairly enjoyable for the most part. It's harmless horror entertainment. I think I probably would have liked it more when I was a kid. But that being said, it's not completely worthless. I do genuinely like the Bad Apple segment and the haunted house little short in the prologue. It's fun to it's fun to see. I can even speak. It's fun to see Sean Astin do a fun little role like this. It's definitely equally as fun to see James Karen do something like this, because he doesn't really do a whole lot of stuff like this. So it was really a lot of fun to see James Karen play in this particular sandbox. The direction could have been better. So could have been the screenplay. The director and the writer also could have been a better person. But as a film, I've seen worse. I've seen better. But I would say when it comes to these PG-13 young adult horror anthologies, this is one of the better ones I've seen. But that's not saying much because there isn't really a lot of them. But I would say if you like things like Are You Afraid of the Dark, Goosebumps, Eerie, Indiana, I would recommend checking this out sometime. I do feel that it's worth at least one watch if you're a fan of those kind of horror anthologies. I would say definitely don't go into it expecting a masterpiece, but I think you can have some fun with it. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed my review, and as always, I will see you later. See ya.